First, I would like to mention a couple of things of why this topic is relevant for us and why we are continuing such discussions on the platform of our traditional forum organized by the informal club, so to say, Friends of European Russia, the Forum of Friends of European Russia. This question, can Russia become democratic, is very important from a variety of perspectives, both in long-term perspective and also today. First, I would like to say that I belong to the camp of Europeans and Lithuanians who stick to the belief that Russia, like us, like Ukraine, like Belarus one day, has all chances to become democratic. I see no reasons why we should not believe in this future. Myself, I have written an article which produced multiple responses, because in Lithuania we have some psychological complexes, and quite a few people don't believe in democracy in Russia. I tried to explain why their arguments don't convince me. I do believe that Russia has all chances to become a democracy. This is important for us because if Russia turns into a democracy, our neighborhood with Russia transforms a lot, and the security of the entire European continent changes extremely, because usually democracies don't wage wars against each other. This is why our interest is very practical. On the other hand, the belief that Russia can become a democracy is closely interrelated to what we are seeing today during this war of aggression of Putin's regime against Ukraine, when in some Western capitals we see some fluctuations and oscillations regarding how much we should support the aspiration of Ukraine to win in this war, when the victory of Ukraine only depends on Western weapons. I think that some Western capitals are lacking belief that Russia can become a democracy, especially after Ukraine's victory in the war. And when this belief is missing, then they start reflections that the victory of Ukraine can lead Russia to a full collapse and full chaos. It scares some leaders, and then they are hesitant to share Leopards or something else with Ukraine. This is why it's so important for all of us not only to discuss whether Russia can become a democracy, but also to discuss strategic steps for us to get closer to this. One strategy is what Russian opposition should have. This is why they should bring together their efforts and make the strategic steps. On the other hand, the West also needs a clear strategy on helping this transformation of Russia into a normal European democratic country. This also must be discussed intensively. So I would like to stop here, and I'm happy that we have this company of panelists together. The inspiration came to us from our previous conversations with Professor Lev Ponomarev and Leonid Gozman and other permanent panelists of our clubs. However, I think what we are going to discuss today is crucial both for Russia and the entire European continent, and even more for the entire world. So I will definitely stop here. Apologies. Thank you so much, Andrews. You were quite on time. You fit into 5 minutes, and I suggest 5 minutes as the timing limit for all panelists, and I ask you to stay within this limit. We really have very interesting participants. Lev Ponomarev, human rights defender, Gennady Gudkov, a former member of State Duma, also the commentator, and today we can say quite recently, but also political prisoner, Leonid Gozman, and Igor Yakovenko, journalist, and I would like to give the floor to everyone for introductory remarks. So first, we will speak in Russian. Second, for those who don't understand Russian or is not fluent enough in Russian, you have interpretation, so please stick to English channel. Third, if you want to give a question, also Nikolai Koblякov, human rights defender and journalist from Paris. I'm sorry, Vasily Bertin, he represents, and he's the main magnet for all activists and anti-Putin activists in France today. I'm sorry, Nikolai, for forgetting to introduce you. So for those who want to hear interpretation to English, you have it on English channel. If you want to give your questions, please give them in the chat box. And in the chat box, you can also, you both can write your question and mention to whom this question is. And there will now be an opportunity to give questions with the voice. So now I'd like to give the floor to Lev Ponomarev, who, as I understand from our previous conversation, is trying to answer this question, whether Russia can become a democracy. So Mr. Lev, the floor is yours.
Микрофон.
Нет звука.
Лев, микрофон включи.
Да включи, все ж такое все забывает. Спасибо Андрюсу, который сделал введение.
Thank you, Andrews, for making this introduction, so I can skip my own introduction. So now, in Russia, the regime is very similar to German Nazi regime. Hundreds of political prisoners, the war of aggression, overwhelming propaganda, lack of all declared political freedoms declared by international political institutions. So some countries, though delayed, started defending Ukraine and helping Ukraine's defense, and we can hope that Ukraine will prevail and the war will finish on the terms and conditions of Ukraine, and the Russian troops are back to the borders of 1991. There are many discussions of this, and I hope that my colleagues will support this, but this is something that everyone's discussing, while our point is somewhat different. The second problem is the existence of fascist state in Russia is not resolved even once Ukraine wins. This is why we should all share this concern about fighting the repressive regime in Russia. This should be the concern of all Western countries. We can use the historical example from the outcome of the Second World War, when fascism was defeated and Germany was occupied. And only thanks to this occupation, the country underwent the denazification. However, Russia will not be occupied. So both these tasks, Ukraine's victory in the war and denazification of Russia, should be addressed simultaneously or almost simultaneously. The sooner both tasks are merged, the more effectively they are resolved, and it also can lead to quicker end of the war. So the denazification of Russia should be conducted collectively by the United West on the top level. I will take the risk of mentioning the steps to be taken already now to liquidate the repressive regime that can also push the Western governments towards doing something in this area. Because I can claim that almost nothing is done in this area. There are lists of persons targeted by personal sanctions. These lists must become longer. They should expand by not only including the people who instigates the war, but also those who support the regime and its economic sustainability. These are our former colleagues, liberals, who are saving the fascist regime from its full collapse. Their Western assets frozen in the West should be used for paying reparations to Ukraine. As I understand, this process is underway already. Simultaneously with expanding the sanctions lists, there should be the declaration about an opportunity of excluding people from these lists if these people contribute to the change of the political regime and building democratic institutions in the country. Once the regime is changed, the new leadership of the country should be warned in advance that the West will introduce tougher sanctions, including economic ones, until the new leadership starts feasible steps towards re-democratization of Russia. As the first step, we can mention the release of political prisoners, the uh, uh, repulsion of anti-democratic laws, democratic elections, the repayment of reparations, and prosecuting the instigators of the war. The interim government in the future should include representatives of the opposition. The next step that must be made already now is to create the so-called information machine, in quotation marks, which will rely on all technologies, information technologies, to broadcast for Russians, explaining the advantages of democratic rights and freedoms with specific examples about the values and preferences provided by democracies. It will require significant resources and intergovernmental decisions. We can definitely say that there are enough gifted journalists for this. Remembering myself in the youth, it was thanks to the Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America I became anti-communist in my high school. There are some opinions that there is no one to appeal to in Russia to change the mentality of Russians, that due to the so-called genetic selection, all Russians are slaves. And even some Russians say this, who have left Russia. Quite obviously, this is a Nazi and racist viewpoint. I would like to remember that 30 years ago, Russia underwent a peaceful democratic revolution which brought freedom and democracy to Russia. This was not led by one leader. It was conducted by the people, by taking to the street without following some populist who could again lead to a democratic regime. How long will it take to educate the people to support democracy? There are some arguments made that millions of Russians support the war affected by propaganda. The surveys demonstrate that most of these are senior citizens living behind the poverty line. So I'll try to finish later. So this topic of Russians' participation, I will elaborate on it somewhat later. Just to complete, I would like to say the following. Mr. Kobylius has also recently reminded in his article that the new countries that have left from Soviet Union, these countries got democracy from Russia because this is where the first rallies happened for freedom and democracy. This is where GKHP was defeated by peaceful people and rallies, and only then the majority of other countries and other Soviet republics received their freedom and democracy. So in the end, I would like to say that it must sound provocative, that Russia is a kind of homeland of democracy in post-Soviet era, addressing the peoples of Baltic states, Poland and Bulgaria. I would like to remind you that you should repay your debts.
Что это россияне брали пример с литовцев, которые погибли у
Well,
телебашни.
maybe many of those will say that Russia was taking example of Lithuania, where there was a handover of the TV tower to Vilnius, and I'm going to be the devil's advocate, and I'm going to refer to Gennady Gudkov for 5 minutes, and then we will continue our discussion. Answering the question, first of all, I would like to thank Andreas Kubilius for his beautiful article. It served as a case for many discussions whether Russia will be democratic and should it be democratic. Undoubtedly, without democratic Russia, there will be no peace and no harmless, no normal situation in Europe or in the world. It will be a constant source of threat, including a war with the use of nuclear weapons. So we must make Russia democratic. But I would like to say the following, dear friends. Right now, we are developing the plan for Russia to transit to democracy. And I would like to pay attention to the following factor. In 1917, Russia was in the First World War, and the army was deep in the trenches. And at the same time, various militia forces established their role, military formations, the navy, the army people were creating militarized groups inside Russia. So there was a disintegration trend. The monarch lost control over the shaping of the military forces. And right now, I can observe, I would like to focus your attention on the fact that the same thing is sparkling in Russia. Private armies of Kadyrov, Prigozhin, the governors caught an order, or they managed to convince the headquarters in order to establish regional armies of the territorial defense. And Shoigu, Minister of Defense, is creating his own army. So this is very similar to the scenario of 1917, when some militaristic forces are going to be come into power, and there will be a discord between them. And it seems to me, when we answer the question whether Russia should become democratic, yes, it must, but how? If we do not want to see disintegration of Russia, the war against everyone, we together with the West, with the MEPs, with the European governments, the governments of the UK and the US, we should understand that taking Putin away from power in the current conditions, the connection is lost. There are no conditions for the mass riots of people. If we want the elites to make a coup, we should, well, not we, the opposition, but the collective West, should send a message to the part of the elite, to the part of the bureaucrats of Russia who are capable to remove Putin from power. Maybe they are not deep in blood of Ukrainians. Maybe they are not dirty in this blood. Maybe they have not become military criminals, and we should send a message to them. Guys, if you want to get an indulgence, if you want to get rid of this situation, we are sending you this proposal. This is a message for you to think over how to make it. So, briefly speaking, we should draft for the leaders who can push Putin away from power these strategies. What are the most efficient strategies? It's a carrot and a stick. We do have a stick like sanctions, pressure, military victory, and also providing weaponry to Ukraine. All of these things will weaken the regime, and the regime will destroy. But where is the carrot? I do understand that I'm going to be criticized, but we should say what the part of the elite will get that will push Putin away, and who will start reforms democratizing the country. And I believe we, in order to avoid a very bloody division and split of Russia, we should develop a clear strategy that would enable us to get allies in some elites. Maybe we should start with information cooperation. Do we need information? Yes, we do need this. And financial cooperation, organizational cooperation, and the Russian opposition and Ukraine need money for fighting it. We need people and resources. So these stages of indulgence should be proposed to those parts of Russia who are ready to accept that, because we need a stick and a carrot. We understand what our stake is, so we have to draft the strategy of the current. Did I fit in the 5 minutes? Yes, perfect. Just ideally, you're just like a professional radio headliner. I'm going to wrap up what our panelists said, but I will say this later. I'm passing the floor to Leonid Gozman. Leonid, by the way, I would appreciate if all of the panelists adjust their ideas in order to cover the things mentioned by Mr. Ponomarev and Mr. Gudkov. Leonid, the floor is yours. Yes, thank you. Do you copy? Yes, we copy. I'm going to skip the intro and I'm going to address the main question, whether Russia can become a democracy. There are three sub-questions or sub-components in this question. Whether the Russian mindset, religion, climate, culture, whatever, have anything preventing Russia not to become a democracy, what would devastate the democratic institutions, whether Russia is doomed to authoritarianism. I agree with Andreas Kubilius, who has said there are no such factors. When they say that Russia cannot be a democracy, they refer to the particularities of the mindset of the Russian people, but quite often these are just ethnic stereotypes not based on evidence. All serious research works say that Russians are not different from others, that the level of support of authoritarianism and cruelty is not higher than in other countries that passed through such rule, and right now the support of the war is not as high as it is believed. So this is the answer to the first sub-question, that there is nothing in Russia preventing Russia to become a democracy. The second question is when the democratization process can start in case of authoritarian rule. There's a prerequisite, a military victory of Ukraine. A military and a political loss of Putin, which is equally important. We have to understand that if Putin wins the war, then Russia will dive into totalitarianism for several generations, like after the coming of Bolsheviks to the power, but only military victory of Ukraine will be just a suspension of fire. If we want to see peace for all and democracy for Russia, then I understand that the Putin's state should be destroyed. This is just like in 1945. And if the Allies allowed Hitler's state to stay in power in 1945, then the Third Reich would start a war again. The same will be done by Putin. And some politicians in the West prefer to see a long-lasting war, which would allegedly decline the risk of the nuclear war and weaken Putin. But the risks of a nuclear war are higher the more Putin controls the situation. When there is a loss of control, maybe he won't be able to push the button. But the paramount thing is that weakened Putin's Russia will be even more aggressive than strong Putin's Russia. He doesn't care about the quality of living. People cannot impact the situation, and if there is a long-lasting war, Putin will become more aggressive. Therefore, for the sake of the world, not only of Ukraine and Russia, is to give weaponry to Ukraine, helping Ukraine to win as soon as possible. And the third question, when this process of democratization can be successful, it all depends on the standing of the leading Western countries. Certainly, they can build a virtual Iron Curtain and leave forgetting about Russia, but I don't think this will happen because Hungary and angry people in this area will build new fascism that might be even more horrible than the current one, and this will be a new threat to the world. It seems to me it would be better. Well, I may not demand this from the politicians in the West, but I believe it would make sense to have the same strategy like the attitude to Germany that was in 1945, not like in 1917. And there should be a new Marshall's Plan after there's the victory of Ukraine, after there is an agreement for paying war reparations, etc. But this plan is needed. Without this plan, Russia will not build democracy. The previous failure of democratization in 1990s, and this process was getting very strong moral and financial support of the West. This does not mean that this is not possible. The Putin's elite will not prevent the process of democratization. They are cynic, they are selfish, they think only about themselves. At the same time, there are many wise, qualified, working, pro-European, active people who are ready to do this together with the West, and the population of large cities, especially young people and educated people, would support this process. We should understand that the Marshall's Plan for Russia is a win-win game, and Russia will get democracy in the world, will get rid of the Russian threat, and many people in Russia, including me, will be happy to be engaged in the development and implementation of this plan. Thank you. 6 minutes, thank you very much. I was doing my best. And right now, I would like to wrap up what our presenters said, the Marshall's Plan for Russia. And this is added on top of the carrot to be shown to the elites. I'm passing the floor to Igor Yakovenko. Thank you. I believe we live in the world of probabilities, and answering the question whether Russia can become a democracy, yes or no, this would not be a responsible attitude. There can be various scenarios. First of all, we have to say what are the crossroads or pathways that would either exclude or include democracy in Russia. First of all, we have been speaking about the devastation of Putin's Russia and the victory of Ukraine. The defeat of the Putin's army is not the only pathway. In this situation, Russia can see rights and a pre-revolutionary state, and Russia has seen such cases in 1917, etc. Every time that happened after the military defeat, the Levant's War in the 17th century, after the defeat of the Russian-Japanese War in 1905, and after the actual defeat, however, it seemed that Russia was winning in the First World War, but the soldiers stopped their activities, and then the October Revolution transferring into the civil war. So Russia is ready for that. This is the privatization of the army referred to by Mr. Gudkov. In fact, there is a trend. The trend for disintegration. The Tatarstan people decided to leave the Russian Federation. 2 wars in Chechnya. There was the parade of sovereignty across the country. In fact, Russia is an empire, and there are very strong trends for disintegration. As soon as the central power weakens, then there will be a stronger disintegration trend. And there are 2 options. Option 1, after a serious military defeat, Putin stays in power, and then there will be no democracy. And Putin can stay in power for a long time. This will be a, a long-lasting, not very active war with Ukraine, Kazakhstan. This will be a very long process of light wars, and there will be no way for democracy in Russia. Everybody agrees that nobody is going to occupy Russia. This is evident. Nobody is going to occupy a huge country equipped with nuclear weapons. There will be no democracy in Russia for a long time. The totalitarian and fascism regimes are defeated either through capitulation, like in the case of the Third Reich and Japan, or the death of the dictator. The death of the dictator, this is not what we can influence, therefore total military defeat. But in this case, this will not mean that the regime will definitely change. Option 2, right? Disintegration of Russia. I do know that in the West, they are very much afraid of the disintegration of Russia, and the same was about the disintegration of the USSR when the American president visited Kiev and he was convincing the president of Ukraine not to leave the USSR. I can only say that if the if we did not have the breakup of the Soviet Union, then, well, maybe there would be some standalone stories about the Baltic states, but right now we can see that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the newly established states have different pathways. The Baltic states were quite fast in developing their democracies. Other countries have different pace. Ukraine is quite rapid, and they break through blood to get to democracy, to Europe. And I'm coming to the core of my speech. You have 1 minute. Well, okay. I will formulate it right now. I believe the breakup of Russia is probably the most right pathway to democracy, because Russia, as an empire, will definitely replicate and reintroduce the sentiment of revanchism, of fighting back, and the disintegration of Russia will be the only way out. Russia will not fit into Europe, into democracy in its entire territory. I mean, only parts of it can become democracies, and the West can help about it by working with the standalone parts of Russia for them to become democracies. There is a chance for that. Thank you very much, Igor. And the last individual review is by Nikolai Oblykov from Paris.
Благодарю за приглашение, поскольку я представляю
Thank you for
организацию.
your invitation. As I represent an organization, I must make a disclaimer, because as this is a discussion, my opinion in some details might be different from the opinion of Russie Liberté organization, which is quite a mature organization, even 10 years old, which is unfortunately the only, in fact, by the moment when Sakharov Institute also moved to Paris. The answer to the question whether Russia can be a democracy, clearly it is possible. In our paradigm, after the article of Kubilius in the beginning of January, where he introduced 5 quite strong arguments, the question that should be discussed today, or at least the one that I would like to provide answer to, is how to achieve it and how to minimize the transition costs, which is obvious. There are certain points that were mentioned by the previous speakers, such as the collapse of Russia, Marshall Plan, threats of Europe. These are the ideas about which the liberal thought is evolving in France, trying to find these answers. From our perspective, the most correct are such discussions, and we position ourselves as a broadcaster of opinions of Russian civil society, and we have also stated we and European civil society can represent among the people who have left Russia and working on Russia from outside Russia on domestic political agenda. Something that I would like to outline first on support of some Russian organizational efforts. There is a small comment that Sakharov Institute, led by Lev Alexandrovich, still has no French account, which is quite a good demonstration and indication of attitude of European and French institutions, that this organization cannot even have an account, though this might be even more important than providing some one more tank. It also seems to us that any consolidation of Russian Democrats or oppositionists in the West, it's not enough to consolidate efforts. It's also important to play by the rules of the European politics. Since we've been here for quite a long time already, there is quite a sad example of Dozhd, which also was mentioned by Andres in his article. Everyone understands that this might be the mistake of Latvia to forbid Dost, but the fact that Dost has not realized that Latvia is entitled to this mistake and not using the Russian interpreter during meetings clearly demonstrates how Russians who try to influence policies and try to influence policymaking in Europe are really bad in it, and this is our problem that we have to tackle. Regarding the split of a list, these are very fine and subtle things. Our point is that everything should be happening according to the European legislation. This is definitely effective, so we cannot turn ourselves into the dragon. What is the criterion of Putin's defeat in the war? Probably this is the Crimea in our case. If Crimea stays with Ukraine, this will be an official military defeat. One more small remark that we need to make, that theoretically the way they gave up Kherson, they also can give up Crimea if Europe stays united. One more important thing about the violence and violent measures. If violent methods that can be used intensively cannot be our tool, it is definitely not our tool. In this case, we represent the merger of French and Russian civil societies. We reject violent methods, and we see it as our main purpose to come up with some joint solution, some joint media tool mentioned by some, which could function and funded by former Russian assets, which could be used to broadcast information to Russians who have left Russia, who need access to some permanent source of information. This is probably something that Lev Ponomarev will cover. And to finalize, I think one of our essential tasks today is to develop the institution of negotiators. Clearly, Putin is a terrorist, and if a terrorist had so many negotiators, these negotiations would never be successful. So there are so many people who are negotiating with Putin. Different countries in Europe have very different positions, and also the US. So as a kind of crazy idea, I would like to have one European country. Although I'm a French national, I really like Lithuania, who I think understands it much better. And if there were one negotiator who would talk to Putin as a terrorist, I think this would be more effective. Thank you. This is it. Thank you, Nikolai, for this clear explanation of your position. One thing that really provoked me, whether it's more important to supply one tank or to open the organization of Ponomarev. In my opinion, supplying one tank is definitely more important because people are in war and dying. while opening an account is not such a tragedy than what we are seeing in Ukraine. Some topics to summarize what you are saying, showing a variety of opinions about events. So Igor Yakovenko believes that Russia has to disintegrate to turn into a democracy, while Lev Gudkov, in some degree, within this opinion, shows us some scenarios of such disintegration, and this is actually an important aspect: emerging private armies and the refusal of Putin's regime, refusal of monopoly to violence, as Marx would say. And there is, of course, the opinion of Lev Ponomarev that democracy is possible. For this, we need more sanctions and more influence on public opinion. As I understand, Nikolai means more or less the same thing when he speaks about the media influence. Also, I like to note that this idea of stick and carrot and the idea of dismantling the system through the split of the elite is really very interesting, and it is discussed quite regularly. I think Khodorkovsky offered this 10 years ago for the first time, and since then, this idea is present in this pool of ideas to be debated. I already have some questions. The questions, there are many questions in the chat, but preliminarily, I'd like to ask if there is anyone among our panels to take 20 to 30 seconds about something that they strongly disagree with or strongly agree with other panelists. Anyone?
Я категорически не согласен с
I
тем,
strongly disagree that we need to support the disintegration of Russia. This was quite unexpected for me to hear it from Igor Yakovenko. Disintegration of Russia is definitely going to be bloody, very bloody. We know that there are administrative borders. We understand very well that the borders are very unjust between Russia and Kazakhstan. And who will succeed from Russia? For example, in Tatarstan, Tatars are the minority. This is a very difficult question. I try to stop the disintegration of Russia, and I saw that somewhere this was happening. In Chechnya, this was happening in the bloodiest way possible. So we should make every effort to make sure that the temporary government, which would include our representatives or should help us, we want to make sure that this government is strong and prevent the disintegration of Russia. Igor, do you want to give some brief answer? No. No? Great. Okay, then I will move to the questions on the chat box, and then I will have my own questions to the participants. Gennady, I just want to say that there are large differences between Soviet Union and Russia. Soviet Union was a unitary society. In August 1991, when I was a part of KGB USSR, we were ordered to shoot into the people. This was ordered by the leadership of KGB to shoot into the people. We had to cleanse the square in front of the White House. We had to attack it with 3 columns. We had to organize filtration camp. We were ordered to suppress any resistance, including by weapons. And we disobeyed, we defied this order, because these were people whom we knew, these were our friends and comrades. We all knew each other. While now in Russia, sometimes I also argue with my colleagues, we have so many contradictions in Russia. It will not be possible to disintegrate peacefully the way it happened in the USSR. We understand that Putin can lead to disintegration of Russia, but we should not help him. If it happens objectively, it just happens. It is beyond our control. But if we can make some difference to preserve the country and to turn it into free and democratic, we have to try to use this chance.
Значит, я думаю, что вот эта что мы не должны ставить перед собой
I
задачу.
believe we should not put a task to either disintegrate or integrate Russia, because this is outside our prerogative. We cannot influence this. The only thing we can influence is that when the situation develops, we could try minimizing violence for blood not to be shed. We can only minimize. And I would like to support our colleagues who say that we should leverage the elites, but we should be aware that the Russian democratic opposition, neither in Russia nor abroad, cannot defeat the Putin's regime. It can only be removed through the split of the elites that might happen after a military victory of Ukraine. Thank you, Leonid. And I'm now going to the questions, and then I will get back to my own moderation of my questions to you that I would like to ask. I would start from the end. Yelena Katyonочkina is wondering, any of you, please volunteer. If maybe if the stick of including bureaucrats and the sanctions cannot influence the situation, then what other sticks can be used? Should we use the stick of putting the labels? Should we use the stick like the invitation to the tribunal? Who would like to comment? Leonid, you will be first, and Gennady will be second. Undoubtedly, we should do that, and we believe that this is sufficient. The propaganda officers are concerned about The Hague, and they are concerned, the political leaders put air defense systems on the buildings in Moscow. I support this. This is going to be the first step that would facilitate. We cannot split the elites, but we can facilitate this. And if military criminals are divided from those who have not become military criminals yet, then this will be the first screw in the coffin of the autocracy into splitting the elites. So this should depend on the accusations and on the punishment. Mr. Ponomarev, what do you mean when you speak about unfair border between Russia and Kazakhstan? What work should the Russian political class do in order to avoid such words? This is about Mr. Churches from Belarus, who was commenting this. No. I should say that in early 1990s, the movement called Democratic Russia did everything. Not only, well, we supported Lithuania and all others, but we did everything for Russia not to break up. We understand what would be the strategy if Tatarstan left Russia, and Tatarstan is inside Russia. So we've managed, first of all, some people suggested to Yeltsin to put military there, and we reconvinced him not to do that. And then Tatarstan remained in Russia. At that, some agreements were concluded. There was a unique story. Some parts of Russia, or a part of Russia, signed a treaty with Russia. It was a transition period, so probably that's the way to address such issues. Now, commenting the Kazakhstan issue, I know that northern Kazakhstan is populated with Russians, and there was a question about the fairness of the border. By the way, there was the conversation about Crimea, and we have managed to stop the leadership of Russia not to try to move the borders, because when you move borders, then you see blood. Thank you, Lev. It's an interesting follow-up question, the question by Elena Katyonочkina, and I think that this will spark discussions among our panelists. Is it possible to to launch the parade of sovereignty and deep federalization of the Russian Federation to prevent disintegration of Russia. I believe that the entities of Russia would prefer the second option. Lev said no disintegration to Russia, but what would you answer to what Madam Katyanychkina wrote? In fact, I'm confused about the mood of our discussion, about the following. We believe that we are as if in the government making decisions. I'm totally convinced that the degree of influence of the political immigration and of the democratic forces inside Russia is very close to zero. We cannot influence, they cannot influence the situation in Russia. Speaking of the breakup of Russia, we may want this or dislike it, but our influence on the process is going to be minimum. This is the process that will definitely start. The people who support the humanistic position should understand what should be done about it. In my view, it is very important to start working with the regional elites. It's important to start working with them, considering how they could democratize. There were similar attempts to preserve the Soviet Union. The US and other external observers tried to do that, and they failed. These are internal processes that cannot be stopped. Speaking of Tatarstan, I perfectly know the situation. I had a large research there, and my outcomes were similar to the outcomes of the referendum. I know that the threat of force stopped disintegration. I was in close touch with the leadership of Tatarstan, and I know that the threat of violence impacted them. And it was similar to the situation in the Chechen war. So the poisonous and the efficiency of this process is not to try to block the process, but to try to manage the process. And Madam Katyanychkina expresses her idea, with which I agree. But the question is, who will be the addressee? Who is going to be accused? Who can launch the parade of sovereignty? I believe there is a serious challenge about the scenario to be drawn after the war, where the democratic forces are going to be, in what place. This is going to be my next question to you, Igor. Since you started discussing this, I think it is interesting. Since you say that it's impossible to democratize everything, then some parts of Russia should be democratized, if I'm getting you right. So the question is, well, I'm speaking about your own opinion, and what parts of Russia seem more democratic than others? How this process can be organized in the situation when this is just pure theory, as you are saying it correctly. There are no reasons to believe that the revolution will change everything in Russia tomorrow. Maybe there should be Ataturk in every part of Russia, in Tatarstan and any other places, for some 30 years to have the modernization through autocracy. You know, we should listen to the people, not to try to break people. There is no sociology in the autocracy states. Therefore, all of the opinion pollings are not efficient. The efficiency is close to zero. Let's say the following. The fate of various parts of Russia is going to be different. I don't fully understand what is common between Yekaterinburg and Chechnya. I really don't understand the difference between the Chechen Republic in terms of their identity. Their identity is much more different from Vladivostok rather than the identity of various European nations. The only thing that sticks them all together is the force. Therefore, keeping Russia in this shape is wrong by exercising violence. I do agree with the idea that we should not prevent self-determination of these areas. They may become a confederation later. This will be normal. And the last thing that I would like to mention, we should listen to some stories that we have been hearing. There were various serious attempts to democratize Russia, temporary government. There was voting for democratic forces, failed. Perestroika and 1991 Democrats closed the door of opportunities, and we can see what happened out of the reforms and the freedoms Russia got. So we got what we have here, the fascism regime. Imperial mindset of Russia is associated with a few attributes: nuclear weapons, membership in the Security Council of the UN, perception of the historical legacy of Russia as an empire. This is the spirit of empire that is shared not only by Putin but even by the representatives of the liberal circles. Even after leaving Russia, they keep looking at other nations from the top to the bottom. They try to teach them. I'm not going to be speculating about some mistakes or errors. There's like mentorship, impossibility to see through the optics of other nations who have better lives, who are better than us, and people visit them and they start telling them what they should do. So this imperial mindset is very difficult to get rid of, and you can get rid of it only once the empire is devastated. You have been talking for quite long, and we can see that this coincides with other comments. And some abbreviation PCH. This is about human rights. Okay. Somebody is asking about the role of the Russians in the future historical process. What should be the attitude of opposition to Russians? So to sell them, it will not be possible to sell the idea of breakup of Russia to the Russian people. And there was a question to Andres Kubilis why opposition would not unite. So, okay, what is the role to be played by Russians, by Russian citizens? What should be the role, or what will be their role? Who would like to volunteer? I would like to take the floor. Friends, in fact, after today's discussion, the anti-war committee made a statement, and they neglect the fact that there are people living in Russia and that their opinion is going to be decisive. Igor briefly touched that. In fact, the efforts of the West, and what I've mentioned before, and I believe that my colleagues share it, these efforts should be focused on explaining and raising awareness. We should base on our supporters. Where are our supporters? They are in large cities where they have more than 1 million of people, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The previous democratic revolution was in large cities of 1 million people and more. So if we consider this opportunity, we should consider the places. So Moscow, first of all, we should dialogue with these people, and we should explain to them, the West should explain to them how this would happen. So at the very beginning of my presentation, I said that there should be strong media outlets, not to substitute, no. Ecom, Vasco and Darsta, they provide information, but there should be media outlets to start explaining to those who are in doubts in Russia that democracy is the only system that would let you live as good as they live in Lithuania and in other countries. There's one question to you, Lev, because I used to work in the media outlet and I continue working there. Look,
о событиях последнего года.
Look, we're discussing the developments of the previous year. Before 24th of February, before the full-fledged aggression against Ukraine started, or starting with the beginning of the war and annexation of Crimea in 2014, before all these prohibitions, Echo Moskvy, Dost, Novaya Gazeta existed very well, including also Meduza and others. They all existed, but was it? But did it make difference? So in addition to supply, we also need demand. And as I understand from what Igor says, any opinion surveys in Russia are not so reliable. We can, of course, believe that maybe they reflect at least some part of reality, but clearly at least 50% of population, maybe they don't support the war, but they don't want anyone to bother them. They just give their country to Putin. They say people in Kremlin know, and I can just watch some comedy show or some other entertainment show. They have YouTube and WhatsApp. They have many things, but for some reason, Dost television didn't make difference. So you suggest creating something else, something that will reach every home, to replace Kremlin's propagandists. Why do you think it will make any difference? Because first, I would say there is this huge tragedy which is happening, and people are concerned. They might understand that they might have done something wrong, and they have missed this time. Another point, as Igor has mentioned, history. In history, sometimes we have revolutions, and later we have counter-reforms, and this is what happened in Russia. It's true that my democratic colleagues and myself failed to prevent it, and now we have to think how we can help these people hear us and help us hear them. And I am sure, I will just give a small example. When we had voting in Moscow on constitutional amendments, Putin won in Russia, but do you know that he almost lost in Moscow? The constitutional amendment, and this was a crucial voting. And why did he lose? Because some of our leaders made a mistake. Alexei Navalny said that people should not go to vote. Yabloko said that people didn't know to go to vote, while observation worked well. Observation community is very strong in Moscow, and just several percentage points were missing for Putin to lose the voting in Moscow. So many things are hidden. Many people think that that's true, that they made some mistakes in the past. There are some rightful accusations against democratic leaders as well. So we should use it. If it's so hopeless, why should we collect together and discuss these things? If success is possible, and I'm sure the success is possible, we should target the undecided ones. The Democrats are there, they will support us. And the elite coup, which is very likely, and we all say that this is the likeliest scenario. And later on, we have to try to influence those people in the government. And by the way, these are the same people in the government. These are also the people. And they're reducing the bar of pressure, and people will start moving. I'm sure that people are waiting for their chance. I would like to ask about this, the question on opposition, to which I'm getting But we're all speaking about the elite coup. Maybe someone else want to react to this. I can give you an example. Well, not just an example, but an option. What can happen if this elite coup happens? If we have a series of military defeats, maybe the loss of Crimea, or maybe not even the loss of Crimea, but just the defeat in Donbass, resulting in Putin leaving the political stage. So he's visited by Jesus Christ in the night and he chooses to be a monk. And we have some collective Mishustin who remains, who might even defeat some FSB people who want to continue the war. And you know what happens? And I can come up with this option. By the way, Andrews Kobilius can confirm if this is realistic or not as a politician. And these people say that, now we have this collective leadership. We release Navalny, Yashin, Karamurza, and someone else. We repeal a couple of laws. We prosecute 3 or 4 majors for military crimes somewhere in Bucha and Irpin. But as we are new Democrats and we have Mishustin Spring underway, the black forces of Putinism want to undermine this route. This is why we will not repay the reparation. You can take the assets of oligarchs and give it to Ukraine, but we cannot pay more. And we will not prosecute the leadership because we are the leadership. We forget the Donbass, but we prefer keeping Crimea. Otherwise, Putinism will overtake the power, and we want democracy. And the European Union and Washington might say, okay, because we are having this new spring and new perestroika, and they have released Navalny. Okay, Crimea can stay with Russia, we can lift the sanctions, and some measures are prosecuted. And I'm sure that your colleagues will accept it, Andres. This is the question to Andres. Come on, in the West, the West has to react very strictly. This is our point. Okay, my question is to Andreas.
Во-первых, что такое коллективный Запад, это еще нужно как-то ответить себе вопрос, но я скажу
Well,
очень
this is not up to me to speak for the collective West, but my answer is very simple. I think that the West
возрастает в своем понимании, что
is becoming more aware that democracy in Russia is good not only for Russia, but for the entire Europe. For the first time, the NATO finally included it in Madrid Declaration that the authoritarian Russia is the main threat to European security. So this is also the interest of the West to make sure that Russia proceeds towards democracy by evolution or by some other ways. In this regard, I pose the question differently. If we have the Russian opposition, which is in Russia or in Europe, or in Russia in prisons, of course, the change comes to Russia because the citizens will bring about and implement this change. This is not the West which will do it, but the West needs to understand its own clear strategy, how the West can help the Russian opposition and the Russian citizens. And my picture is that in Russia, like in other societies, in this situation, in such post-imperial states, Russia has a competition of 2 mental aspirations. One mental aspiration is the imperialism of Russian thinking. And on the other hand, like in other societies, a dream of normal life should emerge in Russia. I don't know how widespread this dream is, but the fact that imperialism leads Russia to deadlock is quite clear. And the question for the West is quite simple: how to help the Russians to start forgetting their imperial dream. For this, we have the victory of Ukraine and tribunal over Putin, and even Ukraine's membership in NATO can help the Russians to start forgetting their imperial thinking. While on the other thing, the West can help a lot already now to Russian citizens to start hoping for normal European life. And in this regard, what Leonid has been saying about Marshall Plan, when we use such metaphors frequently, they provoke misunderstandings. However, we need to understand that the Marshall Plan was not only about reconstruction of economy of the Western Europe, but it was mostly about stabilizing post-war democracies across Europe, and also to prevent communists from coming to power because of the poverty and and destroyed economy, to prevent radicalization and communists coming to power. So in Lithuania, we have such a strong nostalgia for the past that in 1992, people didn't vote for the liberation movement, which brought about independence. They voted for the former communists. And the European Union showed us the way to the EU membership and democracy. So this was the second Marshall Plan, so to say. So finishing up, I think what the European Union should be thinking now is to agree with the representatives of democratic Russia about relations between EU and democratic Russia when Russia turns to democracy, and how we will recognize it, whether Mishustin or real democracy. Again, we also have to think about it. Well, Mishustin will be very willing to use money for Marshall Plan. We are sure about it. Gennady Gudkov and then Leonid Gozman. Gennady was the first to raise his hand. That's 2 points. Lev Ponomarev is right about large media outlet. This would be highly helpful. The demand for information exists. I can feel it from our accounts. Second, why all these media have been removed from the Russian media sphere? Because they became dangerous when they were not that dangerous. The regime tolerated them, but when they became too dangerous, they were eliminated. Now, dozens of millions of people, opponents of war and opponents of Putin's regime, don't have leaders because they are in emigration or in prison. They don't have their own civil society organizations or institutions or parties or some collective organizations such as media. If some large media outlet emerged broadcasting from countries like Poland or Lithuania, well, it could happen in Kiev, but Ukraine doesn't want it. And I think maybe it's not right, but they don't want it. We can't impose it. But somewhere it should emerge to consolidate the people who are against Putin and who are ready to support reforms in Russia. And second, when you, Konstantin, say that collective Mishustin will come, and he'll say, okay, here is the way. To whom will he say it? Will he say it to the air? He will speak to the West, to the European Union. Yes, he will speak to the West as the power and decision maker. But this is the role of the West, to say, no, Mr. Mishustin, you are still under sanctions, and you will not have money, and you need to meet certain terms and conditions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you don't meet the conditions, then this is your own choice. Here are your personal security guarantees, and you should step down. So our hope should be that the West doesn't make compromises, and they stick to principles and values. to support the reforms with participation of Russian opposition with guarantees under the supervision of the West. Okay, so now we have the question. Yes, thank you for identifying yourself. Hmm. Oleg, who speaks about the problem of consolidation of the opposition mentioned by Kobylis. Why we don't have in Russia something like Charter 1977 as it was in Czechoslovakia? How can we overcome this problem of consolidation of democratic forces? Anyone with a recipe, how we can consolidate the opposition? Okay, thank you. The consolidation makes sense when some powerful actors join their forces, when they have certain crowds standing behind them or some funds or something. Then it makes sense to join forces. But when people come together and they don't have all these resources, there is no point in consolidation. It might produce some PR effect, but rarely it makes sense because people don't see any point in consolidating because it reduces the individual status of each of them. So I think there is no real problem of consolidation of real actors of Russian opposition. There will be no problem when the moment comes. You can be sure. And also in our new history, we have history of people joining efforts, although they hate each other, but they did join forces when they saw that it's effective. Coming back to the previous point, that of course the West is more powerful now than we, and it's important to understand for the West that compromises with this regime are not possible, that the war has to finish in full capitulation of the Putin's regime as it was in 1945. I can explain how it can happen. If it doesn't happen, if it doesn't materialize, nothing materializes. Any remainder of this cancer cells will produce metastasis. So what Konstantin spoke about, so-called Mishustin, I assume that the West might accept it, and this will be the fatal mistake, which will lead us back to the war and going in circles. And the last thing I would like to ask all colleagues and listeners not to frighten each other. Russians are not scary people. There is empire. We don't have any imperialist syndrome. We have the imperialist leadership, but no one wanted to introduce troops to Tajikistan. Of course, there are certain ethnic stereotypes, national stereotypes. Of course, many people in Russia are arrogant, but this is not only typical for Russians. To many, unfortunately, people are not angels. And there will be no resistance, there will be no obstacles from the nation to democratic reforms, because the support of Putin today is not ideological. This is not the support of fascists or imperialists. These are the support of people who are ready to support anything. They might believe in any bullshit that the Ukraine has attacked them, but of course these people will not be active.
Тему, которую мы обсуждали много лет, вот что все равно есть некое
This is
меньшинство.
an interesting topic that we have been discussing for years, that there will be the minority, like it was in the 90s, that would change the development of Russia. I was not saying that it would change it. But back then, we can plant problems for the future because of what the minority did, the majority may reject. Yes, the majority can, but let's address the problem when the problem emerges. Let's try getting back on a normal track for the war to be stopped. Today, we see that the war has been going on for 11 months, this horrible war. And by the way, the imperial renaissance that all of us have faced, as well as the world, was not associated with the resistance of the majority of the population. No, the mechanisms were different. We should not blame it all on the population. That's the right position. Well, wait, Konstantin, there will be a brief comment from me. We will not explain to our compatriots, we will not explain to them that they should live normally. We will not be able to explain unless those speakers of the democratic opposition will continue feeling that they're superior of the people. If you call people idiots, dummies, then you should not expect them to listen to you. The question by Natalia from Free Russians from Munich, Germany. Do you believe necessary to work with the European population? The former MEP Eva Christop writes here that this is about those who require immediate peace, ceasefire, irrespective of what is going to be in Ukraine. I'm addressing this question to Nikolai Koblykov, who has not been actively engaged here. Whether we should work with the population of Europe. Yes, indeed, I have my ideas. Well, our organization is not a diaspora. We have a website in French. We unite, we consolidate people who care about the fate of Russia, and the half of our members are ethnical French. And when all of us say that the Russian people are imperialists, that Russians want to support Putin, then we should not forget that 40% of French supported Le Pen. And there's a fraction in the National Assembly. There were fractions in the National Assembly leaving the Assembly when there was a vote on the resolution to accuse the war. So, this happens under the anti-Americanism sentiment in France, but this is not only the problem of the Russians. The French, who are from France, and France stopped being the empire by the end of late 20th century. They had Algiers, one of their colonies, till then. So they also have very strong imperial sentiment in France, and working with any anti-democracy and working on anti-imperial thinking. This is important. I recall Landsbergers, who was saying in Vilnius and Lithuania that we want Putin. How can we fight in the war for democracies to win? So we were forced to go beyond our human rights mandate, and we were against these sentiment to support Le Pen. This is in order to suppress any imperial sentiment. So there's an answer to that. We are working on it, and there has been a movement established in Bulgaria, including Bulgarians, Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, all of them are against Putin and against the war. We have done a lot, but I'm not going to be speaking about that. I'm going to be speaking about the challenge to be addressed. Millions of people left Russia. Hundreds of thousands of them are in a number of countries where the governments have not decided what to do with them. So right now, the progressive Russian elites in Kazakhstan, or pro-Russian elites in Mongolia, Georgia, Armenia, and in other countries, we should be working with them. We should develop some coordination program, and I would like to suggest being engaged in that for us to suggest to the European Union what to do. Well, this vision is clear, and this is a subject to a standalone discussion. But the last question, because we're short of time, the last question by Eva Christopher from the former MEP. The question is how Russian opposition sees the position of Germany about the supplies of the Leopard tanks to Ukraine. In fact, this is a broader question. This is a question about supplying weaponry and what should be done in order for Ukraine to gain victory. A part of Russian opposition leaders support Ukraine, but there are some nuances. I would like anybody of you who would like to take the floor to answer this question briefly for 30 seconds, just to provide the answer, and then somebody who would disagree would take the floor. Despite the fact that despite the fact that we have arguments to prove that the opposition of Russia is disintegrated, but still there's a connection issue on Mr. Ponomaryov's side. Lev, you have disappeared. Yes, there's some connectivity issue. Okay, I would like to take 15 seconds. You see, Lev is back. Okay, you disappeared. I don't know anybody who would support the position of Germany or the US who are afraid to provide tanks. Yes, we should provide all necessary weaponry to Ukraine for Ukraine to win the war. I would like Ukraine to get all weaponry that they request. But at the same time, I understand that the right to make a decision belongs to the sovereign nations of the Western world, and we can ask, we can provide our arguments. We may not demand. Well, the question is whether Ukrainians may demand. Yes, they may, but we may not. Are we short of time, or do we still have some minutes? I don't know. I don't know whether we stick to the schedule of Zoom. Wendy?
Можем еще 10 минут.
We can take 10 more minutes. Okay, I have 10 more minutes and then I will have another session on air. Okay, let's continue. I have a question to you, gentlemen. I'm looking at the questions in the chat. So I have the following question. If we speak about the situation when we need to explain to the Russian society what is good for them, what would be great for them, living in democracy, etc. So the question is, this massive media processing, we speak about serious propaganda, in fact, right? Who should take care of this? I will reiterate, we have Dost, Medusa, and others, they have not influenced Russians. What can be influential, what can be efficient, because we can see that until now, these efforts have not been efficient when working with the majority of the people. They have been addressing the middle class, small groups in cities, but those people who send their husbands and sons to the war, they are not going to be covered by these efforts. So what should be done? I will try answering the question. There was a reason why I referred to the Soviet times when Radio Liberty and Voice of America graduated future dissidents. That happened. So the existing media outlets are perfect, but they just respond to the facts, and they should be the propaganda media outlets to promote democracy. This is a different set of skills. They use different tools. These people can be found among Russian journalists who have relocated to other countries. They can be Sputnik and others. It is possible to use the internet to expand coverage, but this is different from the existing media outlets working in this field. Thank you. In fact, the question is about technologies, whether the technology it affects people. Anton Arzakovsky sent a question, and he is my old friend. It's a question about opposition, and Oleg Elanchik wrote about it to us. What is the consolidation of the opposition? Who should consolidate? Khodorkovsky, Kasparov, and Navalny should create a single front to be joined by Ponomaryov and Gudkov and others. What is the consolidation of opposition? It's an important issue because Charter 77, referred to by Ponomaryov, it was a consolidation of intellectuals who were far from the ordinary people, but they affected the nation of Czechoslovakia. So what can we say about consolidation?
Геннадий,
Gennady? Yes, I raise my hand. First of all, I'd like to say that for some reason, people would like the opposition to be consolidated, but the question is, what for? Every group of opposition is in contact with the other. Some of them do political lobbying, some of them do investigations, others do networking, etc. So, if we say that the Russian opposition should consolidate, there should be a plan. There was Charter 77 that merged the people. Well, maybe we should do the following. We can propose consolidating around the draft constitution, draft new constitution, what we would like to see instead of the current Russia. Not some calls, declarations, or statements, but let us draft the document that would cover the future system of the state of Russia. If we agree that we have consolidation, we have a commonly shared plan, understanding, and then we would develop joint actions for the plan. That's the easiest way.
дело в том, что
I would like to disagree. Our colleagues in different places draft the constitution, but we are here in order to influence the West, the Western governments, but they would like to know what we want.
эффективны именно на процесс демократизации России, а не на то,
We can be efficient in the democratization of Russia, but not about the constitution, because this can be forever.
конечно, я бы хотел.
And certainly consolidating the figures that you've mentioned is important. That's what I would like to see, but they may not be willing to do that. The plan for democratization of Russia was described. There were other publications, and I would like Khodorkovsky and Kasparov to support this, but Kasparov is saying that there are only bad Russians living in Russia. So there's a disintegration. Maybe they will fail consolidating, but maybe the West should hear and should listen to our group. Certainly, the more of us, the better. You've mentioned Khodorkovsky and Kasparov. They wrote an article in Foreign Affairs that sparked lots of discussions that the West should not be afraid of the collapse of the Putin's regime. Do you agree with this, all of you? No, of course not. I agree. I agree. I fully agree. I don't understand how to we are waiting for the collapse. Okay, Putin collapses under the pressure. We are dreaming of this to collapse and for his regime to be defeated. Wait. The West should not be afraid of. Period.
Нет, слушай,
Lev
я
Ponomarev.
бы
Wait, listen.
говорил так, что коллапс это вот развал полный.
When you say collapse, Konstantin, you probably mean full, complete
В рамках сценария, который возможен.
destroying. But I'm speaking about the possible scenario. We have been speaking about the possible scenarios. All of us have been discussing possible scenarios, the coup of the elites and how to work with the elites for blood not to be shared and for the chaos not to be started, because I do not support chaos. We have been referring to lots of history today. My background is history, but I always think that our situation is unique, like any other historical situation. But if we refer to the times of the Lenin, should the opposition be speaking about the defeat of the Russian army, that it should have a defeat by taking the risk that the majority of the Russians will not like it? So should we do it? We have been speaking about that. All present here do the same. We are not saying anything else. This is natural. So it's an important, critical question. So this should be a consolidated view of the opposition, irrespective of what some Ivan Petrovich in Orenburg is going to say to that. That we should explain to Ivan Petrovich in Orenburg, Russia, well, indeed, we should explain that Putin's army and regime started the war not only against Ukraine, but the world and the people of Russia. We should say that we support the defeat of the Putin's army not because Andres Kubilius hired us to do so, but because we understand who the real enemy is. We are sorry, but we cannot even explain this to Jean Bardo, what Putin is doing. And you're speaking about explaining this to a person in Orenburg. There's a professor in the lyceum who believes that by 20%, like 20%, of them believe that Putin is fighting NATO. Write an article on our website. We'll translate this into French. Okay, I will write it. The last question is, I do understand we have not been speaking about Ukraine really, and Ukraine has been suffering from the horrible war, from the murders, rape, etc., and the devastation of the infrastructure. Should Russian opposition, despite negative attitude to practically all Russians, should it establish contacts with the with the Ukraine? Gennady? Undoubtedly, and we have been doing it. We do understand the emotions of ordinary Ukrainians. We understand this, and we justify that. But we should understand that the political elites of the civil society, and the government and the press should understand that without establishing normal attitudes between the nations, without setting up relations, we won't be able to build peace, security, and democracy. Igor Yakovenko, what do you think about this topic? You have been silent for a while. Well, in fact, this is a rhetorical question. Those who can do that, they do it. I'm looking at our panel. Everybody who takes the floor is invited to Ukrainian TV channels maybe 10 times a day. That's what happens to me. And I try to deliver my views to the audience, proving that many Russians are against the fascism regime. They support Ukraine and they do everything to defeat the regime. Moreover, I would have a different look at this issue. I do not agree with Leonid that Russia has no imperial mindset. No, this is there. This is the issue of identity. This is a different subject for a conversation, but it's very important to change the optics. In order to be on the same page with the Ukrainians, you should have the Ukrainian optics on the things. I mean, the empathy. I mean, feeling their pain and getting rid of your imperial views. For example, stop saying great Russian culture. This is a simple, easy thing. Just stop using this adjective. There is no great Russian culture. There's beautiful Russian culture that we learned. We speak Russian language, but it is as great as Lithuanian, French. So stopping having imperial mindset is what we have to do step by step. Okay. Thank you very much for that comment. This has been a very interesting discussion. I would like to appreciate our interpreters. I have been working for a while as an interpreter, and I know it was not the easiest topic for interpreting. So I appreciate the efforts. I appreciate the efforts of Andres Kvidis and other our host, and I would like to appreciate our presenters. I had to be a provocateur today, and I believe that our next discussion will be in a better condition for Ukraine. And I'm passing the floor to Andres Kubilius, and I thank you very much. And I believe that we'll see each other quite soon again. Andrius, do you have the closing remarks? Thank you very much. Thank you, Konstantin, for your brilliant and provocative hosting of our event. Our event was very fast. I really appreciate all our panelists. It was a very interesting discussion, and this has become clearer where we are, both the Russian opposition and the Western people who are concerned about the future of Russia. I believe that you cannot do things overnight, but everything is in the future. We will continue working on this, and we will continue and we may organize an offline conference in Brussels for all of us to be there, because the future of Russia, the democratic future of Russia, how to prevent the changes in Russia not to go to take a wrong pathway. It is critically important for the European continent and for the world. Therefore, we should unite our efforts to find strategic steps that would really bring us to what we would like to see. And how this is going to happen: democracy first, and then federalization of Russia, or maybe federalization of Russia and only then democracy. We will have an opportunity to discuss it in the future. So thank you very much, and see you in the future. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you.